They called me obsessive, a perfectionist, a man who couldn't leave well enough alone. My neighbors in the small mountain town of Fraser, Colorado, watched me work on my cabin every single day for 18 months, making modification after modification, testing idea after idea, spending countless hours on projects they considered pointless. They'd shake their heads and mutter about wasted time, about how I should just turn up the thermostat like a normal person instead of constantly tinkering with systems that already worked. But I wasn't trying to be normal. I was trying to solve a problem that had fascinated me since childhood. How to create a building that stayed warm in extreme cold without consuming massive amounts of energy. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 52 years old and I'm what you might call a serial optimizer. I've spent my entire adult life taking systems that work adequately and making them work exceptionally. For 25 years, I was a process engineer for manufacturing companies, analyzing production lines, identifying inefficiencies, implementing improvements that would save fractions of a second or fractions of a cent. Improvements that seemed trivial individually, but added up to millions of dollars in savings over time. I approached everything in life the same way. When I cooked, I'd experiment with temperatures and timing until I'd optimized every recipe. When I drove, I'd calculate the most fuel-efficient routes and speeds. When I exercised, I'd track every metric and adjust my routine based on data. My ex-wife used to say I couldn't just live life, I had to engineer it. She was right, and it's probably why we're divorced. In 2021, I bought a small cabin in Fraser, Colorado, a town that proudly calls itself the icebox of the nation, because it regularly records some of the coldest temperatures in the continental United States. Winter temperatures routinely drop to 20 or 30 below zero, and the heating season runs from September through May. It's exactly the kind of extreme environment where heating efficiency matters, where small improvements can make significant differences in comfort and cost. The cabin I bought was typical for the area, 900 square feet, built in the 1980s, wood frame construction with decent but not exceptional insulation. It had a propane furnace, double-pane windows, and all the standard features you'd expect. The previous owner's heating costs had averaged $400 per month during winter, which seemed high but was actually normal for Fraser's brutal climate. Most of my neighbors were spending similar amounts, some even more. I moved in during summer 2021, and I immediately started analyzing the cabin's thermal performance. I installed temperature sensors throughout the building, in every room, in the attic, in the crawl space, on exterior walls, measuring temperature differentials and identifying where heat was being lost. I used a thermal imaging camera to find air leaks and cold spots. I measured the furnace's runtime and fuel consumption. I documented everything in spreadsheets, creating a detailed baseline of how the cabin performed. My neighbors thought I was crazy. "Why are you measuring temperatures in every room?" asked Tom Bradley, who lived in the cabin next door. "Just set the thermostat to 68 and forget about it. That's what normal people do. We don't obsess over every degree." But I wasn't interested in being normal. I was interested in optimization. And the data I was collecting showed me that my cabin, like most buildings, was incredibly inefficient. Heat was escaping through dozens of pathways, the furnace was cycling on and off constantly, and the temperature distribution throughout the building was uneven and wasteful. I spent the fall of 2021 making my first round of improvements. I sealed every air leak I could find, using caulk and spray foam to eliminate infiltration. I added insulation to the attic, bringing it up to R60, far beyond code requirements. I installed insulated window coverings that could be closed at night to reduce heat loss through glass. I wrapped the hot water heater and insulated all the pipes. These were conventional improvements, the kind that any energy auditor would recommend. They reduced my heating costs by about 15%, which was good but not exceptional. My neighbors saw me working constantly and couldn't understand why. "You're spending all your time and money on insulation and caulk," said Tom's wife, Sarah. "Why not just pay the heating bill and enjoy your retirement? You're wasting your time trying to save a few dollars." But I wasn't trying to save a few dollars. I was trying to understand the system, to identify every inefficiency, to create something that performed at a level most people thought was impossible. The conventional improvements were just the beginning. Winter 2021-2022 was my laboratory. I monitored the cabin's performance obsessively, tracking indoor and outdoor temperatures, furnace runtime, fuel consumption, and comfort levels. I identified patterns that most people would never notice. The furnace would cycle on when the thermostat read 66 degrees, would run until the temperature hit 68, then would shut off. But the temperature at the thermostat wasn't representative of the whole cabin. Some rooms were 70 degrees while others were 64. The floor was always cold, maybe 60 degrees, while the ceiling was 72. The system was maintaining an average temperature, but it was doing so inefficiently, with massive temperature gradients that represented wasted energy. I started experimenting with circulation. I installed small fans to move air from the ceiling to the floor, reducing stratification. I added vent boosters to push more heated air into the coldest rooms. I created convection loops that would naturally circulate air without requiring powered fans. Each modification was small, each one seemed trivial, but together they started to make a difference. My neighbors watched me install fan after fan, vent after vent, and they thought I was wasting time on projects that couldn't possibly matter. "Marcus is up on his roof again," I'd hear them say, installing another vent or fan or some contraption. "He's been working on that cabin every weekend for months. When is he going to just accept that it's good enough and move on?" But good enough wasn't good enough for me. I could see in my data that the cabin was still inefficient, still wasting energy, still capable of significant improvement. By spring 2022, I'd reduced my heating costs by another 10% through circulation improvements, bringing my total savings to about 25% compared to the baseline. That was good, but I knew I could do better. The breakthrough came when I started thinking about thermal mass. Most wood frame buildings have very little thermal mass, which means they can't store heat effectively. They heat up quickly when the furnace runs and cool down quickly when it stops. That constant cycling is inefficient and uncomfortable. I needed to add thermal mass to the cabin, but I needed to do it in a way that was practical and affordable. I couldn't rebuild the walls with concrete or stone. I couldn't add a massive masonry heater, but I could add thermal mass in strategic locations where it would have maximum impact. I started with water. Water has the highest heat capacity of any common material, and it's cheap and easy to work with. I built a thermal storage wall in my living room, essentially a large bookshelf filled with 55-gallon drums of water, positioned to receive direct sunlight from the south-facing windows. The water would absorb solar heat during the day and release it at night, reducing the heating load on my furnace. My neighbors thought it was the stupidest thing they'd ever seen. "You built a wall of water barrels in your living room?" Sarah Bradley said when she saw it. "That's not furniture, Marcus. That's not decoration. That's just weird. You've turned your cabin into some kind of science experiment." She was right about the science experiment part, but wrong about it being weird. The thermal storage wall worked beautifully. On sunny winter days, the water would heat up to 80-90 degrees, storing energy that would be released overnight. The living room stayed comfortable with minimal furnace runtime, and the effect spread to adjacent rooms through natural air circulation. But I didn't stop there. I added thermal mass to the floor, installing tile over a layer of concrete board in high-traffic areas, creating surfaces that would absorb heat from the furnace and radiate it slowly over time. I added mass to interior walls, using drywall compound and dense materials to increase heat storage capacity. Every modification was calculated, measured, and documented. By winter 2022-2023, my cabin was performing at a level that seemed impossible to my neighbors. My heating costs had dropped to $180 per month, less than half what they'd been at baseline, and my cabin was more comfortable than it had ever been. But I still wasn't satisfied. I could see in my data that there were still inefficiencies, still opportunities for improvement. And that's when I started working on the project that would make my cabin the warmest in town. The data showed me something interesting during winter 2022-2023. My furnace was running efficiently, my insulation was excellent, my thermal mass was storing and releasing heat effectively. But there was still one major source of heat loss that I hadn't fully addressed: the foundation and floor. Even with all my improvements, my floor temperature averaged 62-64 degrees, significantly colder than the air temperature of 68 degrees. That temperature differential represented wasted energy and reduced comfort. Cold floors made the whole cabin feel colder than it actually was, and they forced the furnace to work harder to maintain comfortable conditions. I needed to warm the floor, but I needed to do it passively, without adding expensive radiant heating systems or consuming more energy. The solution came from an unexpected source: solar air heating. I'd been researching passive solar design and had learned about solar air heaters, simple devices that use the sun's energy to heat air that can then be circulated into a building. The concept is straightforward. Build an insulated box with a black absorber plate inside and a glass or polycarbonate cover on top. Sunlight passes through the transparent cover, heats the black plate, and the air in the box gets hot, sometimes reaching 140–160 degrees on sunny days. That hot air can be ducted into a building, providing free heat from the sun. But most solar air heaters are designed to heat living spaces directly. I had a different idea. What if I used solar-heated air to warm the crawl space beneath my cabin, creating a warm buffer zone that would heat the floor from below? If I could raise the crawl space temperature from its typical 35–40 degrees to 60–70 degrees, the floor temperature would increase proportionally, making the entire cabin more comfortable and reducing heating loads. I designed a system of solar air heaters that would be mounted on the south-facing wall of my cabin, collecting solar energy and ducting hot air into the crawl space. The heated crawl space would warm the floor, and that warmth would radiate up into the living space. On sunny days, the system would provide significant heating. On cloudy days, the insulated crawl space would retain heat better than before, still providing some benefit. I started building in spring 2023. I constructed 6 solar air heater panels, each one 4 feet wide by 8 feet tall, creating a total collection area of 192 square feet. Each panel had a black-painted aluminum absorber plate, a polycarbonate glazing cover, and insulated sides and back. I mounted them on the south wall of my cabin, angled to optimize winter sun exposure. I ducted the hot air output into the crawl space through insulated ducts, and I installed small fans to circulate the air when temperatures in the collectors exceeded useful levels. My neighbors watched me build these panels and thought I'd finally gone completely insane. Marcus has covered his entire south wall with these weird black boxes, Tom Bradley told anyone who would listen. His cabin looks ridiculous. It looks like some kind of industrial facility, not a home. And for what? To heat his crawl space? Who heats their crawl space? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Sarah was more direct. "You've spent 18 months working on that cabin," she said to me one day. 18 months of constant projects, constant modifications, constant tinkering. When are you going to stop? When are you going to just accept that your cabin is fine and move on with your life? You're wasting time that you could be spending actually enjoying retirement. I tried to explain that this was how I enjoyed retirement. That optimization and improvement were what gave me satisfaction, that I wasn't trying to achieve fine, but rather exceptional. But Sarah just shook her head and walked away, convinced I was obsessive to the point of dysfunction. The solar air heaters were completed by June 2023, and I spent the summer testing and optimizing them. On sunny days, they were producing air temperatures of 140–150 degrees, and the crawl space temperature was rising to 65–70 degrees, dramatically warmer than the 40-degree temperatures typical of unheated crawl spaces. The floor temperature in my cabin increased to 68–70 degrees, matching the air temperature, eliminating the cold floor problem entirely. But the real test would come in winter, when heating demands were highest and when the solar collectors would need to prove their value. Winter 2023–2024 arrived, and my optimized cabin performed beyond even my expectations. On sunny winter days, which are common in Colorado's high country, the solar air heaters would heat the crawl space to 70–75 degrees by mid-afternoon. That warmth would radiate up through the floor, heating the entire cabin passively. My furnace would barely run on sunny days, even when outside temperatures were below zero. On cloudy days, the insulated crawl space would retain heat better than before, and the thermal mass I'd added throughout the cabin would release stored energy, maintaining comfortable temperatures with minimal furnace runtime. My heating costs for December 2023 were $95, compared to $400 at baseline and $180 the previous year. I'd reduced my heating costs by 76% compared to when I'd bought the cabin, and by 47% compared to my already improved performance from the previous winter. But the cost savings, while significant, weren't the most important achievement. The most important achievement was comfort. My cabin was now the warmest, most comfortable building in Fraser. While my neighbors were dealing with cold floors, temperature variations, and constantly running furnaces, my cabin maintained steady 68–70 degree temperatures throughout, with warm floors, even heat distribution, and a furnace that ran maybe 2 to 3 hours per day, even in the coldest weather. Tom Bradley noticed the difference when he stopped by in January 2024. Outside temperature was -15 degrees, typical for Fraser in deep winter. Tom's cabin was struggling to stay warm despite his furnace running constantly. My cabin was comfortable, warm, almost cozy. "Marcus, your cabin is warmer than mine," he said, looking around with confusion. "It's -15 outside, and your cabin feels like it's 70 degrees. My cabin is barely 65, and my furnace has been running all day." "How is this possible? What are you heating with?" "The sun, mostly," I said. "Those solar air heaters you thought were ridiculous. They heated my crawl space to 72 degrees this afternoon. That warmth is radiating up through the floor. Combined with all the other improvements I've made, the thermal mass, the circulation systems, the insulation, everything works together to keep the cabin warm with minimal energy input." Tom walked over to my floor and placed his hand on it. It was warm, noticeably warm, completely unlike the cold floors in his cabin. "This is incredible," he said quietly. "I thought you were wasting your time. I thought all your projects and modifications were pointless, that you were obsessing over details that didn't matter. But you've created something that actually works better than anything else in town. How much are you spending on heating?" "About $100 per month," I said. "Maybe less. The solar collectors provide most of my heating on sunny days, and the thermal mass and insulation handle the rest. I'm using about a quarter of the propane I used when I first moved in." Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could see him doing calculations in his head, comparing my costs to his $400–500 monthly heating bills. "You've saved thousands of dollars," he said, "and you've created the most comfortable cabin in Fraser. All because you were willing to spend time optimizing, improving, refusing to accept good enough." "I was wrong, Marcus. You weren't wasting time. You were investing time in something that actually mattered." Word spread quickly through Fraser after Tom's visit. The obsessive tinkerer who'd spent 18 months constantly working on his cabin had created something remarkable, something that outperformed every other building in town. People who'd mocked my projects were now asking questions, wanting tours, trying to understand how I'd achieved such dramatic improvements. By February 2024, I'd had over 30 visitors, neighbors, and townspeople who wanted to see the solar air heaters, the thermal mass systems, the circulation improvements, all the modifications that had seemed pointless individually, but had combined to create exceptional performance. I walked them through each system, explained the physics and the reasoning, showed them the data documenting the improvements. The response was mixed. Some people were inspired, recognized that optimization and continuous improvement could yield significant results. Others were overwhelmed, felt that the level of effort I'd invested was beyond what they were willing or able to commit. But everyone agreed on one thing. My cabin was the warmest, most comfortable building in Fraser, and I'd achieved that through persistence, knowledge, and a willingness to challenge conventional thinking. Sarah Bradley, who'd been my harshest critic, came by in March 2024 with an apology and a request. "Marcus, I'm sorry I said you were wasting time," she said. "I didn't understand what you were trying to achieve. I thought you were being obsessive for no reason. But you've proven that attention to detail matters, that small improvements add up, that refusing to accept good enough can lead to something exceptional. Would you be willing to help us improve our cabin? We're spending $500 per month on heating, and we're still cold. I don't expect we can achieve what you've achieved, but even a 30–40% improvement would make a huge difference." I agreed to help, and over the next several months I consulted with the Bradleys and several other neighbors on heating improvements. Each situation was different. Each cabin had unique challenges, but the principles were universal. Seal air leaks, add insulation, improve circulation, incorporate thermal mass, and where possible, add passive solar heating. The results varied but were consistently positive. The Bradleys reduced their heating costs by 35% through a combination of air sealing, insulation improvements, and a smaller version of my solar air heating system. Other neighbors achieved 20–50% reductions through various combinations of improvements. Nobody matched my 76% reduction, but that was because nobody was willing to invest the same level of time and effort. They wanted good results with reasonable effort, which was a perfectly rational approach. I'd wanted exceptional results regardless of effort, which was probably obsessive but had proven effective. By winter 2024-2025, my second winter with the fully optimized system, the performance remained exceptional. My heating costs averaged $90 per month, and my cabin maintained comfortable temperatures even during Fraser's coldest weather. The total investment in all my improvements over 3 years had been approximately $8,000, including materials for insulation, thermal mass, solar collectors, and various other modifications. I'd saved approximately $10,000 in heating costs over those 3 years compared to baseline, meaning the improvements had paid for themselves and were now generating pure savings. But the financial return, while satisfying, wasn't the primary reward. The primary reward was living in a building that performed at a level most people thought was impossible, that stayed warm in extreme cold with minimal energy input, that proved that optimization and continuous improvement could achieve remarkable results. The jealous neighbors who'd said I was wasting time had learned an important lesson. Time invested in improvement isn't wasted, even when the improvements seem small or pointless individually. It's the cumulative effect of many small optimizations that creates exceptional performance. The University of Colorado sent researchers to study my cabin in 2024, interested in documenting the various systems and understanding how they work together. They installed monitoring equipment, collected data throughout an entire year, and analyzed the thermal performance in detail. Their findings confirmed what I'd been documenting. My cabin was using 76% less heating energy than baseline while maintaining superior comfort. The solar air heating system was providing approximately 40% of total heating needs. The thermal mass was moderating temperature swings and storing energy effectively. The circulation improvements were eliminating hot and cold spots, and all the systems were working synergistically, each one enhancing the performance of the others. The researchers published their findings, and suddenly my cabin was being discussed in building science circles as an example of what's possible when someone applies engineering principles and continuous improvement to residential heating. I was invited to speak at conferences, to share my experience and encourage others to think differently about building performance. The message I shared was simple. Most buildings perform far below their potential because we accept good enough instead of pursuing exceptional. We install the minimum insulation required by code instead of asking how much insulation would be optimal. We accept cold floors and temperature variations as normal instead of questioning why they exist and how they could be eliminated. We treat buildings as static objects instead of as systems that can be continuously improved. My cabin had become the warmest in town not because I'd used expensive technology or exotic materials, but because I'd refused to accept good enough, had invested time in understanding and optimizing every aspect of thermal performance, and had been willing to make dozens of small improvements that added up to exceptional results. By 2025, 4 years after I'd bought the cabin, the obsessive tinkerer had become the local expert on heating efficiency. The neighbors who'd mocked my constant projects were now asking for advice. The town that had thought I was wasting time now recognized that I'd invested time wisely, creating something that would provide value for decades. My name is Marcus Webb, and jealous neighbors said I was wasting time when I spent 18 months constantly working on my cabin, making modification after modification, refusing to accept good enough. They thought I was obsessive, dysfunctional, unable to just relax and enjoy life. But that time wasn't wasted. It was invested in creating the warmest cabin in Fraser, a building that uses a quarter of the energy of comparable homes while providing superior comfort. The neighbors learned that optimization matters, that small improvements compound, and that refusing to accept adequate in pursuit of exceptional can yield remarkable results. That's the story of how an obsessive engineer turned a typical mountain cabin into the most efficient building in town, and the lesson about persistence, continuous improvement, and the value of refusing to settle for good enough when exceptional is possible.